Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Now, see, you receive honorary degrees, David, and I actually did my first, you must have done this 100 times in your life, but I gave my first commencement address this morning.
Wonderful. Where?
At CUNY, for the CUNY Baccalaureate, the Bachelor of Arts program. They had me in to do it, and I got to wear, how many times have you done that commencement address?
45.
45 to 1, it sounds like a...
What did you talk about?
Well, I said, because they put me in full academic robes with the colors of my school, McGill in Canada, and my mortarboard on, and I came out and I said, this is the first time I've had full academic regalia on since I graduated from McGill, with the exception of a few evenings with my wife when she was dressed as a schoolgirl, and that was the... And for some reason, that got the kids very excited. I don't know. It was all sort of downhill from there.
Wonderful.
From that, but I talked about it. David, I brought out my well-thumbed copy of The Greater Journey, Americans in Paris, your new book, which I had in the bound galley and reading with enormous pleasure. I also brought out as a kind of prophylactic, my own anthology of Americans in Paris from several years ago.
A book that I drew upon for my book.
That's I know we have many characters in common. It's a wonderful book. And one of the things that's thrilling about this book, I thought, David, was that we all know the story of, or many of us know the story of the artists and writers who went to Paris in the 19th century for what I call kind of bohemian experience, to get drunk, put on their academic regalia with girls dressed as schoolgirls, and generally to have a good time. But there's also a story, another story about serious people, scientists and politicians who go to Paris to learn, and a different kind of story. And that's one of the stories that's very rich in your book, and no one more incarnates both sides of it than sort of the first hero in your book, who is Morse, Samuel Morse.
Samuel FB Morse, who was a painter of note and had achieved success at a relatively early age as a portrait painter. He'd painted a magnificent portrait of Lafayette, which still hangs in City Hall downtown. And he had painted a president, and he had painted a number of distinguished people, but he felt that his skills weren't sufficient enough, and he wanted to go to Paris to work on his work. He said, I need Paris. And while he was there, he undertook the painting of what really is his masterpiece, the Gallery of the Louvre, which has been of interest to people for a very long time. It's an enormous painting, 9 by 6 feet, and he did it by moving a giant movable platform that he had built, a kind of movable scaffold, because many of the paintings that he was copying for his portrait of the interior of the Louvre were hung very high. And he became a kind of tourist attraction in himself, because people wanted to come and see this peculiar American up on this sort of bizarre circus-like looking contrivance. He was a very inventive man, as you know. And he succeeded in painting that.
And this, may I add, David, this is a painting of paintings. It's a real tour de force.
It's a painting of paintings in which he is, in effect, rehung the interior of the Louvre with those 30-some paintings which he thought were the most important masterpieces in the collection. They're nearly all Italian Renaissance paintings, the Titian and Michelangelo and Leonardo. And he was doing it against all tradition, but he was also doing it against the reality of the worst epidemic of cholera ever to hit Europe, the first epidemic of cholera ever to hit Europe, and subsequently there was never anything comparable to it. 18,000 people died in Paris
what
in
year
less
are we
than
in?
6 weeks, 1832. And he thought he was going to die at any moment. And he wrote so to his brothers back here in New York, saying, I go to sleep at night not knowing whether I'll wake up. People were literally falling dead in the streets of the city. And his friend, James Fenimore Cooper, whom he had met for the first time at a White House reception for Lafayette in 1828, was also in Paris writing, and Cooper came to the Louvre every single day through that whole horrific time to keep Morse company. And it's really, I could have written a whole book about that one painting and the human story behind it. But it's really a story of friendship, literally the friend in need. But while he was in Paris and France, Morse also saw something that gave him the idea for the telegraph. So he came home, back to New York, with not only this magnificent painting, which, by the way, is going to be on exhibit in the National Gallery in Washington this summer, came home with a painting, but with the idea for the telegraph. When he perfected the telegraph and the Morse code, he then went back to Paris to try to secure a patent. And while he was there, met Daguerre, who had invented photography, the daguerreotype. Was just bowled over by what Daguerre had done and asked him if it'd be all right if he brought it back here. So he returned to New York, bringing photography, set up a studio down on Washington Square, the first photography studio in America where you could go and get your portrait painted. So this one man, because of his time in Paris, brought home what is one of the masterpieces of American art, the telegraph and photography.
Exactly.
Now that's what you call
good holiday.
Coming back from Europe. Yeah. And my criteria was, I had a number of criteria. This was a very different kind of book for me because I got to cast it myself. Mm-hmm. And
you mean, David, in that sense, you got to choose who you wanted
that's
to
right. If you're writing a conventional history or a conventional biography, you can't just decide to leave people out.
You're writing about Roosevelt, you have to write about McKinley.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Perfect analogy.
Right. Even if McKinley is not all that
even
interesting.
if you wish he didn't make the cut, yeah.
So which kind of happened to the poor guy.
With this project,
right.
I could pick my people. And so I couldn't include everybody because if you did that, it would be a catalog. So my criteria were they had to have been Americans who went to Paris for a specific purpose, which would help them excel in their chosen field. Ambitious to excel, not to be rich, not to be powerful, not to be celebrities. They wanted to excel. And most of them were young, in their 20s. And keep in mind, there were no schools of art. There were no schools of architecture in the United States of America. Medical education was abysmal. Paris was the medical capital of the world. And there's very, very little here in the way at that time, in the way of theater or opera or ballet, virtually nothing. So they had to be on their way there to improve themselves and to come home to better serve their art form or their profession and their country. And they had to have written very good letters and kept diaries, so I had something to work with. And they had to be compelling stories unto themselves. A man like Augustus St. Gaudens, for example.
It comes in later. It comes in. Well, what struck me, if I may say, David, as I read it, is I had the sense, reading through it, that there were 6 standalone books you could have written about some of the people in this book.
Yes, sir.
And one of them...
You saw that?
I absolutely... Well, writer to writer.
No, I don't say... Nobody said that to me.
But no, it's true.
It's
and
true.
one of them is, and of course it created enormous fields of envy in me. I was throwing the book across the room. Saying, God damn, I should have thought of that. One of them is, I'm jumping a bit out of chronology here because it's such an interesting, some of the people are so interesting. One of them, who I think almost no one has heard of now, who is extraordinary, is a woman, Elizabeth Blackwell.
Yes, indeed.
Who comes up. Tell about
Elizabeth Blackwell was the first American woman to become a physician.
Very first woman.
Very first woman.
Doctor.
And she was originally from England. She was born in England and brought here as a child. And she worked as a school teacher for a while and then was determined to become a physician. And she got a degree from a medical school in upstate New York. And
She was in Philadelphia, am I right? And couldn't get into
Cincinnati.
Cincinnati.
She
Couldn't
lived
get
in
into medical
Cincinnati.
school.
Yeah,
elsewhere.
and she went to call on Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was also living in
right.
Cincinnati at the time. And Harriet Beecher Stowe said that, well, if you achieve this, that will be quite remarkable. But in effect, that was saying, lots of luck, kid. I don't think it'll work. She decided she wanted to become a surgeon. So she went to Paris, and thinking that the French, if so liberal about so many aspects of life, would surely accept a woman at the École de Médecine, and they would not accept her. So she wound up going to what was a midwife school, where the young women were virtually cloistered, literally cloistered, in what had been a convent, and it was a convent-like life. Excuse me, and she learned all about the delivery of children and the care of the mother and all that. But while she was there, she contracted some kind of disease of the eye, and to her great credit, when it was all over, instead of saying, I contracted that disease in that terrible place where I had to work so hard and I was abused and felt so sorry for myself and so forth and so on, all she said, talked about later, was the wonderful, kind care she'd received in the hospital till she recovered. Because she lost the sight in one eye, that scotched her ambition to be a surgeon. So she came back here and established here in New York the first hospital for women, women's hospital in our country.
It's an amazing story. And you mentioned that she went to Harriet Beecher Stowe, but of course Harriet Beecher Stowe is one more of your characters who made the trip to Paris.
And about whom you have a wonderful chapter in your book.
And I quote her.
It's an
which is
anthology,
easy. It's
an anthology of American writing about Paris.
What touches me about Harriet Beecher Stowe, and you describe extremely well, is that here was someone who came, this is right after Uncle Tom's Cabin has come out. She's suddenly gone from being nobody to a world celebrity.
Yeah.
And not just a world celebrity, but she's perceived as the leader of the abolitionist movement in America, which really was not her role and never had been who she was. And she comes to Paris, and you can feel in her writing, and you describe this so well, David, a kind of resistance to French culture. She really is still a kind of New England sort of woman, and she doesn't want to love the French. She doesn't want to love all those aspects of French culture that would make most of us turn to them. I turned down one of your pages here, but she slowly begins to realize that French life in France is a wonderful thing. She writes, let me find it here. I'm sorry, I thought it was right under my... Oh, yes. What was the mysterious lure of Paris, she wanted to write? What was its hold on the heart and the imagination? And then she says, children are born there with a sense of beauty equally delicate. Oh, I'm sorry, here. She saw French painting as representative of the great difficulty and danger of French life in general. She writes, that passion for the outward and visible, which all their education, all arrangements of their social life, everything in their art and literature, tends continually to cultivate and increase. Hence they've become the leaders of the world in which I should call the minor artistics, all those particulars which render life beautiful. Hence there are more pretty pictures and popular lithographs from France than from any other country in the world. But it produces very little of the deepest and highest style of art. Yeah. You can feel her simultaneously being seduced by the beautiful surface of French life and resisting it. This was a very American response, wasn't it?
I think so. Also, she later on says something I think is so terrific, where she says that it isn't just that Paris is beautiful, but that Paris awakens the innate need and capacity for beauty that's in all of us.
Yes.
And that she felt that had been snuffed out in her childhood. It's one of the very few examples of people of that generation who are a little bit angry at their country. None of these people is ostentatiously disenchanted with America.
That's a development of a later period of post-World War I.
The so-called lost generation, which I've decided wasn't lost.
Who found them?
They knew exactly where they were. They were in Paris.
That's right. And you knew exactly where to find them, in a bar.
But there's no self-pity in this group, right. Even when things are really terrible. And a movable feast, it was not exactly during the Franco-Prussian War or during the cholera epidemic. They went through rough times, many of them.
Well, one of the things I did want to talk about, but before we go to the Commune, the Franco-Prussian War, which is one of the great episodes in European history, of course, we were talking about Elizabeth Blackwell, a heroic figure, but one of my favorite minor figures who figures in your book as well is Thomas Evans. He's a Philadelphia dentist who goes to Paris and becomes a confidant of the Empress.
He becomes the emperor's dentist. He is reputedly the first dentist to introduce gold fillings to Europe. And he became very fashionable, of course, once he was the emperor and the empress's dentist.
The story is told, and one doesn't know if it's true or not, it was like something out of a fairy tale, that the emperor one night had a toothache that no dentist in Paris could fix, and someone said, try that American from Philadelphia. Yeah. Didn't even speak French, and got the call.
But he is the one who managed the escape of the Empress Eugenie when the overthrow came, and the mob was coming to the palace, the Tuileries. And it's a story right out of the most thrilling Hollywood film, and really happened. And he was risking a lot because he had built this huge practice. He had become wealthy. He'd become prominent. He'd become highly respected with a magnificent home of his own in Paris, living as well as one possibly could in the midst of the Belle Epoque, which was about as well as anybody could live. And the whole thing could have just gone right down the drain, and she came to him and, in effect, said, "Save my life." And he did. He got her out in his carriage, in his coach, got down to Deauville to a boat. And one of my favorite moments is when he found that fellow, the English yachtsman, and he said, "Would you please take the Empress over to across the channel to safety in England?" And he said that he had to go ask his wife. So he went and asked his wife, and she said, "Well, I don't see why not."
English, very English response. It's like, it would make a wonderful movie. I was mentioning, I've always thought it'd make a terrific comic opera, or the story of the Empress and the Philadelphia dentist. He went back to Philadelphia and left a collection to...
He left a whole fortune to the School of Dentistry.
At Penn, right?
At Penn in Philadelphia.
And that one of my favorite Americans in Paris.
The other one I loved was Louis Gottschalk, the pianist, who, as near as I can tell, was the first American ever to perform solo on stage in Paris in the 1850s, and he was 15. He was a child prodigy and a composer. Many of you who know music know his work. His work is still played. And he took Paris by storm, and Chopin and others all came to hear him play. And the prodigies were very common in Paris, and particularly in music since the time of Mozart. But an American prodigy, that was big stuff, yeah.
It was almost like, well, part of the appeal, as you talk about, of the idea of America was the idea of the noble savage. And in fact, they brought over some actual
and the
noble
fact that
savages.
George Kaplan showed up with his Indians was, oh boy, no American painter ever caused such a sensation in Paris as George Kaplan. And I would give a great deal to have been there when he and the Indians went and put on their war dances for the king in the Palace of the Tuileries.
Exactly.
Oh, they had that place rocking. And Kaplan, very sad story. He tried to get our government to take his collection. He devoted his life to it. He took his whole collection to London, and where again it was very popular, but nothing like what happened in Paris. And Louis Philippe, the so-called citizen king of France, was the first one who saw the importance of this collection, because Louis Philippe had lived in the United States when he was in exile during the French Revolution. He and his brother had traveled all the way from Pittsburgh down the Ohio, all the way down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and lived with Indians. And he spoke quite good English, and he was very fond of Americans, and Americans were very fond of him. But he saw the value of that collection, and he bought a number of paintings from Kaplan for his collection, which was then at the Louvre. But Kaplan never lived to see our Smithsonian institution, our government, buy the whole collection, and now it's one of the crown jewels of the Smithsonian Institution.
That's amazing. David, there's so many wonderful stories and characters in your book that I'm racing ahead to share some of them with the audience, but I want to come back just for 1 second to sort of foundational things. Why Paris for so many Americans in the 19th century? And maybe making it more specific, lots of people were going abroad. You sort of were obliged to go abroad at some point. We didn't have the infrastructure, as we would call it now, cultural infrastructure. We didn't have the institutions in this country. People went abroad. Why choose Paris over London, let's say? What would make you choose, say, my destination in life, the place I'll be is not Rome, not London, but Paris?
Paris was, in effect, what New York has been since the end of World War II. It's the cultural capital of the world. If I can make it there, I can make it anywhere. That was Paris. And it was very hard to get there in the 1830s. You had to go by sailing ship. There were no passenger ships, and crossings could be extremely rough. They took a month at best, and accommodations were cramped and not very comfortable. Food was dismal. There was nothing to do, and you really had to want to be there. But there were no art schools, no schools of architecture, no medical schools of any consequence much, and if you wanted to be a pianist, if you wanted to be a painter, a sculptor, an architect, that's where you went, and physician, because Paris was the medical capital of the world, and our medical skills were way behind. Most of the doctors in the United States in that time never went to medical school, and they trained under physicians who never went to medical school. And an American student in Paris could learn as much, and Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was one of the medical students, said this, others said it too, they could learn in 2 years what would take them 10 years or more to learn in private practice back home. But what was so important is that they brought back what they learned, and they changed the teaching of medicine in this country and the quality of medicine in this country. In this country, it was very hard to obtain cadavers for dissecting purposes. They were either considered taboo because of religious or moral strictures, or they were illegal. And as a consequence, they were very expensive. On the black market, grave robbers got them. So that very few students ever got to dissect an arm except on a living patient for the first time, which you can imagine the horror of that. And this is prior to the advent of anesthesia, of ether. The other thing was that most American women would have preferred to die, literally, truly, than to have a man examine their body. And since all doctors were men up until Elizabeth Blackwell, that meant they died, and needlessly. In Paris, there was no such stigma, so if a student were making the rounds with a physician at the major hospitals in Paris, he would follow that physician examining female patients no less than male patients.
Not to interrupt, David, but one of the treasures we brought home from our years in Paris was a series of, I should have brought it with me, of engravings, gynecological obstetric engravings from that period, the most unbelievably elegant things which show a single gloved hand of the obstetrician reaching into the woman's womb as a demonstration piece for students on how to do this. So it was the one place where this necessary medical act was open and shared.
When Holmes went back to walk the memory lane years later.
Holmes Sr., the autograph.
Senior, having taught anatomy at Harvard for more than 35 years, he found that there were very few American students there because the need for American students to go there was no longer. They'd caught up. In his lifetime, he saw them catch up. I think that Holmes is one of the most interesting of all the characters I've written about.
Absolutely.
Because he saw no incongruity, nothing contradictory about devoting his life to medical science and being a poet and being an essayist and founding a magazine called The Atlantic Monthly.
Yes, exactly.
It was all of interest. And he and others all said that what they learned about human nature, about what we might call the humanities, was as important in the practice of medicine for them as what they had learned at the medical school. And another thing that I think comes as a big surprise to people is that if you were a foreigner, meaning an American, you could go to the Sorbonne and the École de Médecine for free, no charge, as long as you were a foreigner. So all they had to pay once they got there was for their room and board.
Yes, and it's an extraordinary thing. And also, and I suppose the welcome embrace of the consequences of sex in France remind us too that in addition to being a center of cultural practice and scientific learning, Paris already had a reputation as the world's capital of pleasure at that point.
No question.
You have some beautiful pages about the revelation of the Palais Royale. And because now when we walk through the Palais Royale, most of us in a visit see it as a kind of dignified and quiet garden where the Ministry of Culture is. Very different.
The Palais Royale was jumping, but it had everything at different levels, and very elegant dining, very elegant society, finest restaurants in Paris.
In the world, really.
In the world. Holmes said, the Palais Royale is to Paris what Paris is to Europe. If you wanted to find the heart of Paris, go to the Palais Royale. And there was much gambling and prostitution. And as you went up levels of floors, the prices got lower and the behavior and class level got lower. So it was pretty rough company up on the
roof. Yes,
floor,
exactly. You could do it.
But and the finest shops in Paris, the finest porcelain, the finest linens, all of that were all in the Palais Royale.
Yes, and the first great generation of restaurants. I've just finished this book about sort of the history, the meaning of food, and that's where our institution of the restaurant really began. You mentioned Very, the first truly great restaurant.
Yes, indeed.
Is right there, and Americans had never seen or tasted
and it's still
anything
there.
Like it's still there.
Yeah, still there.
It's still there.
But take a large wallet if you
at the Grand Palais. Yes, exactly. No, you need.
But their favorite restaurant was the Trois Frères Provençaux, which was owned by three men who weren't brothers and they weren't from the provinces.
Yes, exactly. But interestingly, it was the first place where pot-au-feu became a big deal. In other words, people saw that as a provincial dish, sort of the way we would see Szechuan shrimps or an exotic dish.
And how about the discovery that wine was cheaper than milk?
Yes.
James Fenimore Cooper, who was an extremely hard-working man, worked very hard as writing. Also said that there's always the expectation of a little pleasure at the bottom of the cup. Yes. And they did have a good time. Their time with women was not written about. So all we really have are their letters and diaries, with one marvelous exception, that fellow Gooch, you may remember, who went to the University of Virginia. And he was a medical student. And he decided he was going to keep his private diary of his after-hours life, and he wrote it in French, very bad French, and it's really it's charming. It's not lewd. It's just lively and full of youth and phenomenal resilience to be back in the dissecting lab of the medical school at 6 o'clock the next morning.
After the night before. So all of those things came together. The Paris as the capital of culture, Paris as a place of, at that time, still is, of advanced learning in the sciences, particularly medicine, and Paris as a place of pleasure. And those were the three forces that made you say, I'm not going to Grey London, I'm going a little bit farther.
And I think very important too is the presence of the architecture of Paris. They'd never experienced anything like that. They'd never experienced old buildings. They'd never experienced magnificent buildings, grand in scale, grand in decorative finesse. They'd never experienced the theater that way, or the opera. They'd never seen an opera. And when Taglioni was at her peak, they were just swept off their feet by it, and they all wrote about it. And it wasn't because they were opera aficionados. They didn't know anything about it. And they went every night they possibly could. The idea that there were beautiful public parks. Now, we just take that for granted. John Sanderson sits there in the Tuileries Gardens and says, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had parks like this at home? And what an idea.
Yes, exactly.
They're heady with the intoxication of the life. Just going out on the bridges, just watching the light in the morning or late in the afternoon. And they write about it. And of course, there was a day and age when you were expected to write letters. And if your parents were footing the bill for your being over there,
you better write letters.
And they're worried about your health. And if you're falling into the sinful ways of wicked Paris, they want to hear from you regularly. And they did. And some of them, particularly the sons of the doctors that were there, were expected to report back to their father about what new advances they were being taught or finding out about in Paris, so that the father could get up on what was new in medicine that he needed to know.
Back home.
So that men like Mason Warren, his letters home are, if he'd been a trained writer or a trained medical journalist, he could not have written more superb accounts of what he was learning to his father. And I find that's a bit humbling to see how well these people who did not fancy themselves writers, how superbly they wrote, how well they used the English language.
But actually, that raises another point, which was one of the things that I was curious about in the book, and that is about the mastery of the French language. You would think that the biggest barrier, as it is for most Americans now, would be learning French. Some of them knew French was the international language of the time, so the educated ones knew French going over.
No, they did not.
No.
Because French was not taught in the schools, not taught in the colleges. If you went to Harvard or Yale, you didn't learn French. You took Latin or Greek, but you didn't learn French. Now, those who had Latin and Greek caught on much faster. Right. I don't speak French well at all. I hardly speak French. I can read it, sort of. But we have found, my wife, Rosalie, and I, that as long as they understand, they being your hosts, your friends in France, that you're trying, there's not any problem at all. We have never been treated rudely or snubbed because we didn't speak French. And the Americans were the same way. In fact, they talk again and again. It's not just one or two examples, it's all through what they wrote, of how hospitable and friendly and polite and courteous the French people were toward them, and how nobody defaced public property in the parks. None of the men spit all the time. Of course, back home they're chewing tobacco. And how the French would go out of their way to show you the directions. And so there was never any friction between. In fact, Holmes says the only unpleasant people he met were Englishmen.
Yes, still the case. No, I've always said, and that remains true to this day, is that France is a country where elaborate courtesy offered is met by elaborate courtesy returned, and that the deficit tends to be that Americans have lost the habit of elaborate courtesy. And therefore, barge into bus is saying, does this bus go across the river or something?
Well, we also have the rather bad habit that if we're not being understood, the answer is to talk louder.
Yes, exactly, in English,
shout.
if we can. They fell in love with old Paris, but they also fell in love with new Paris, didn't they? The Paris of the Second Empire, of the boulevards,
which
Baron Haussmann's Paris.
And of course, that's the Paris that we all know. And
the right bank remade in the Second Empire.
And the Grand Boulevards and the Bois de Boulogne being built up the way it was. And the whole Belle Epoque architecture, which should be because of Haussmann. I think I think it's all right to like Houseman now.
Yes.
There was a period where he was condemned as sort of the classic urban renewal destruction artist, and he was to a degree. But on the other hand, when you think of what he saved on the Ile de Cité, he did a very good job.
I think we can look at the Boulevard Houseman and the Grand Boulevard of the Right Bank with a great deal of pleasure now. And
yes, the opera was overdone, but let's have a little fun once in a while.
I've always thought that building, the opera building, reminds me of the Emperor, of Louis Napoleon's mustache. It has the same kind of rococo excess of insecurity being expressed that way. But that leads us directly, thinking about the Second Empire, the rebuilding of Paris by Haussmann, to one of the great tragedies of European history, which occupies a considerable part of your book, and that is the Franco-Prussian War, and the Commune, and what happens after 1870, 1871. And an amazing American, not to interrupt David, amazing American, Washburn, who keeps a diary of those years.
I've been very lucky in that with almost every book I've undertaken, I've found things that I hadn't expected to find or that hadn't been known. And it's thrilling when you do, but in this project, my research assistant, Mike Hill, who lives near Washington and does a lot of work for me and for other writers at the Library of Congress and other resources in the Capitol, uncovered Washburn's diary. It was a letterpress copy that even they weren't aware of at the Library of Congress, because the diary was written on separate sheets of stationery and was bound into volumes by the family, mixed in with letters, and so it wasn't clear that they were diary pages. But then we figured out that the original diary had to be somewhere, so it turned out to be up in Livermore, Maine, which is where Washburn came from. Washburn came from a hardscrabble farm where his mother and father raised 10 children with practically nothing to get by on. They all had to work from the time they were 10 years old on. And 4 of those sons became members of Congress. Never happened before for 4 brothers at the same time, never has happened since. They were all elected from different states and all re-elected, so it wasn't just a fluke. And they were among the original members of the original Republican Party because they were all staunch abolitionists. And Elihu Washburn, who's the character that figures in my book, served in Congress from Illinois, where he got to know another
young congressman,
young politician named Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln was president, Elihu was his strongest member, supporter, and advisor, and the rest in the House of Representatives. And when the war ended, after Lincoln's death, Washburn retired from Congress. He was exhausted, and he was ill. And Grant appointed him Secretary of State, but he was too sick to accept it. So he accepted, because he thought it would be an easy post, to be ambassador to Paris.
One of the most distinguished posts in
Yes, and there was a great hue and cry that this man was a rube from the sticks and that he knew nothing about diplomacy. He had no visible
couldn't sit in the
prior
chair
interest.
of Jefferson and Franklin. And
and it was just a country bumpkin. Well, his wife spoke French. He spoke fairly good French. They went to Paris, and all of a sudden, out breaks the war with Germany and France.
David, would you explain to the audience what happened in 1870-71? Because in France, of course, it's as fundamental and scarring as our Civil War is to us. But I find most Americans don't actually know of what happened.
Well, the Franco-Prussian War was, if you will, is the beginning of a 3-part World War. Exactly. It's Chapter 1, World War I is Chapter 2, and World War II is Chapter 3, where France is pitted against Germany, and it was a needless war. It need never have happened. It was all fought over some ridiculous diplomatic issue concerning Spain, and the French were full of bravura about how important and how magnificent their army was, and the Germans overran the country in no time. and were coming fast down on Paris. And all the diplomats of all the major powers took off, as was perfectly understandable and perfectly agreeable to their governments. Washburn was given the choice, and he chose to stay because he felt it was his duty to be there as long as other Americans were there. And as it turned out, there were only about 150 other Americans who stayed. There were 6,000 or 7,000 before the war began, but they all got out. The French very quickly had the city surrounded and proceeded to starve Paris into surrendering. Now that siege, the starvation of Paris, went on for 4.5, nearly 5 months, and it was horrible. And people were dying, people were starving to death, people were suffering from the cold because there was no wood to burn and to keep warm. It had one of the coldest winters in the history of France. And after it was over, and finally the French surrendered, there was a brief interim of peace when a even more horrible civil war broke out between the French government and the would-be government of Paris, called the Commune.
The left-wing government.
Left-wing government. They weren't communists. The Commune was the idea of a communal government for Paris. And that was really an upheaval showing human nature at its most vile. It was just terrible. Thousands of people slaughtered indiscriminately, executed, women, children, didn't matter, on both sides. Atrocities committed on both sides. And Washburn stayed through that for the same reason. And we now know he kept a diary the whole time. And the diary isn't just quick notes that he might refer to someday if he ever writes his own reminiscences about it. It's a complete diary. And once again, here's a man who had very little formal education, who could write superbly. This fellow supposedly wasn't up to the job. And I think that his example of heroism, his example as a humanitarian and duty is exceedingly moving and ought to be known about. He tried very hard to save the life of the Archbishop of Paris, Darboy, and did not succeed. They executed him. He went as often...
Communards did, yes.
The Communards. And he went as often as he could to the prison to be with him. And he was a Protestant. He wasn't a Roman Catholic. He succeeded in getting 20,000 Germans out of Paris who were uneducated, poor
artisans
working people who swept the streets and carried the laundry, and they had the lowest jobs there were, 20,000 of them, who were subjected to arrest as spies and executed without trial. And he organized the whole exodus of this population out of the city by train back to Germany. Heaven knows how many lives he saved. And a phenomenal man.
And an extraordinary diary. It really gives both a great, a dark chapter and a real kind of tragic...
But one of my favorite moments in the whole book is when Mr. Moulton, do you remember that scene? He was the banker in Paris who was too old to leave.
Yes, in 71.
And the mob came to tear his house down and take his horse and his cow away. And they were, anyone who was conspicuously wealthy was subject to being killed.
Right.
And he had his family there. And none of the servants, the mob was surrounding the house, none of the servants would dare go out to meet them. Nobody would go out to meet him except old Mr. Moulton, who was a little fellow with pince-nez glasses on the end of his nose, who was famous among his friends and in the family for pronouncing French in the most atrocious fashion.
As only an American can.
And he went out to address the crowd. This mob, it's a picture of Les Miserables mob, ready to kill him. And he started to speak to them in French, and they burst into hilarious laughter. And they're literally slapping each other on the back. And he told them he would give them the cow and use the masculine le for the cow. And they thought that was the funniest thing
vache, yeah.
And they let him alone. and never touch the house or anybody in the family. Went away.
If cornered by a left-wing French mob,
Yeah.
speak French badly, and you'll be safe. One of the moving things, though, that happens is that though the commune gives a dark, even tragic section to your book, is that, and it's one thing that's, I think, too little known, is the Tuileries Palace was burned down in the commune and remained in ruins.
They tried to burn the whole city.
Tried to burn the whole city, and that remained in ruins for most of the next decade, which is the very decade we think of as being the height of Parisian beauty. It's the decade of the Impressionists. It's such a beautiful instance of the resilience of human life, but of French civilization particularly. And you end your book in a way, David, with three artists who came of age in that period, three American artists, Sargent, Mary Cassatt, and Augustus St. Gaudens.
Yes.
And it's about the recuperation of cultural capital after that.
I've had a wonderful time working on all of my books, but I have never enjoyed working on a book as much as I've enjoyed working on this one. And the part I enjoyed most is that part of these three amazing Americans. And all of whom, each of whom, is a story unto himself, herself. But the one that appeals to me, I think, above all, is Augustus St. Gaudens. New York City street kid, put to work when he was 13 years old by his immigrant shoemaker father, and who was determined to become a sculptor. And out of sheer determination and an enormous amount of talent, succeeded. And became, in my view, the greatest American sculptor ever. And we're very lucky to have two major works, both done in Paris, which are here, the Farragut statue in Madison Square and the magnificent equestrian statue of Sherman at 59th and 5th Avenue at the entrance of Central Park. Sherman being led by the goddess of victory. And one of the surprises for me in working on the book was to discover that the model for victory, Hetty Anderson, was an African American.
Yes, indeed.
So there's Sherman being led by an African American, and it's just so fitting, so marvelous. And
across Fifth Avenue too, at that.
Yes, heading south. Yes, but if you look at Sherman's face. And Sherman posed here in New York before St. Gaudens went to Paris to do the major piece. I think he posed 12 times for busts, just the face, the head. If you look at that face, it's hard to see from the ground level because he's up mighty high. But it's all craggy and severe. And if you look at it, as I've been able to by looking at the bust, it's the face of a madman. No question. And, of course, Sherman was the one who said war is hell and all moonshine. And if you look at Victory, Hetty Anderson, yes, she is gorgeous, but it's not a face of the glorious cheer and happiness of victory. She's got a look that's sort of a dazed look, like I have just been through hell.
As though she'd really been marching
through. But I have
through
led this man through it and out of it. And St. Gaudens could convey exactly an air of ambiguity of a kind that I think is terribly moving.
You find it in his the Shaw Memorial in Boston as
well.
Yeah,
and the Adams Memorial in Rock Creek Park in Washington for Henry Adams' widow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It struck me reading that last section, that those three figures, Mary Cassatt is the inventor of mother and child as a major artistic subject, John Singer Sargent, who's really the first sort of Orson Welles figure in American art, the first American who's equally at home in Europe
what a good analogy.
And in America as that kind of larger-than-life figure. And finally, St. Gaudens is the first genuinely tragic American visual artist, the first one who has tragic grandeur. It's a huge harvest at the end of the century.
Well, thank you. It is. But also, I can't help but not mention this. St. Gaudens suffered from depression, and it was very serious, and his wife did too. And they were struggling and fighting this much of their marriage. After he'd finished the Sherman, and it was time for him to go home, she'd already come back to get things settled here. He found out that he had cancer. And he decided in one very down spell that he was going to kill himself. And one of his assistants in the studio was present one morning when he came into the studio on the left bank, looked around, then he stormed out. And later he recounted the story to the assistant. But he ran down to the Pont des Arts, ran out onto the bridge to jump off the bridge into the Seine to kill himself. And just as he was out on the bridge, the light came through. It was early morning, and was lighting up the Louvre and the French Institute on the left bank, and the river and all the bridges downstream. And he suddenly thought, and he said this to the young man, I don't want to die, I want to live. And to me, that is so emblematic of that life force that the city seemed to give people. And here it was literally saving that man's life. He came home to live 7 more years and did a great deal of work.
That very spot, I've never said this publicly, David, that very spot on the Pont des Arts with the Institute on your left and the Louvre on your right is a sort of sacred spot to many Americans. It's one of the most beautiful places in Paris, in the world. And we had a very dear friend, an American who lived many years in Paris, great art historian, who died tragically young. And we took his ashes to Paris, and we spread them from that very spot, 5 o'clock one morning. And I hadn't known that was
I
St.
wish
Gaudens.
I'd known you before tonight.
Because I hadn't known that until I read your book, that was St. Gaudens' spot, but that somehow is the sacred American spot. Well, I hope we've given you some sense of the riches and the span of this wonderful book, but I must turn it over to you, to the audience now, and who I know have questions for David. Let me read you a question from West Palm Beach. How do you decide on your subjects well, the second part is more interesting than the first part. If you had to choose one historical figure, one American historical figure whom you've written about, who would you want to travel to Paris with?
Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr.
Ah, yes.
Because he speaks beautiful French.
and
he's immensely entertaining, engaging, and he has a perfectly wonderful sense of humor.
Here's a question. What makes France, and it's a good question, deep question from Rochester, New York, where we're being broadcast. What makes France so seductive to Americans today when the excuse can't be that we are a new country, we don't have art or medicine, etc.? And she adds, merci bien. So clearly she's been seduced.
Well, I've been asked to advise people who are on their way over for the first time of how to approach it. And my answer is savor it, sip it slowly, like a very good glass of wine. No, don't gulp it down. And I think that those Americans who have been there and know it and want to go back have had that feeling that comes over you after a while. I remember the first time that Rosalie and I went, friends of ours were giving us lists of restaurants that we absolutely had to go to. And we were there only a couple of days, and we suddenly dawned on us, they're all good. They're all
yes,
good. And to walk those parks, even though we do have beautiful parks, to walk through the Luxembourg Garden, how could it be any better than that? No. And just sit and watch children playing, or to go to the Louvre and just look at 1 or 2 paintings, or to go into the bookstores on the left bank. It's infinitely, endlessly stimulating, and it constantly is tweaking in a pleasant way your curiosity.
Absolutely, I couldn't have said it better myself, David.
Yes,
and
you
I tried
could
to
have
in
book. French.
What is the most shocking misconception, stepping aside from France now, about American history you have uncovered during your career? Thing people believe, or
that it went easy.
That it went easy. That we were always on a path to.
We have no idea how hard it was, how grubby it got, how many terrible mistakes we made, the cruelty, the heartbreak, the difficulty, even when everything was going right. When I first sat down with Tom Hanks to talk about making John Adams into a miniseries. I said, I just must not be a costume pageant. You've got to convey how hard life was then, how uncertain life was then. And I think, too, we simply don't sufficiently appreciate how much we've been given by those who went before us in every aspect. And we should never, ever take it for granted. In things that we just think, oh, that's the way it's always been. Think of our public library system, for example. No other country has anything like it. You can go and get all the riches, the resources, the ideas of civilization in any city in this country, in most every town, for free. I think of the library doors as the portals to freedom, and they've always been there. But just because they've always been there, we can't take them for granted. And the importance of sustained importance of education from time before we were ever a country, and that we absolutely must maintain the finest possible education that we can provide our children and grandchildren. And we must and we must never forget that the most important people in our society, and I mean this with all my heart, are our teachers. They are doing the work that matters most and the work that will last the longest. And yes, of course they should be paid more, but with that they need more recognition and more appreciation and more of our help. We have to help educate our children in history and in the use of the English language. We've got to talk to our grandchildren and children about this constantly. We're falling behind. Their vocabulary is dwindling. Their knowledge of history is not very good at all, alas. And it's not their faults. It's our faults, and we should do something about it.
Yes, well, they know Paul Revere warned the British, so that's it. you can't really complain about that.
No, we want to skip the obvious stuff.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. That they know already, so we don't have to worry about that at all. That's solid now. Someone asks, to be honest, and we like honesty, historians and writers don't always have lucrative careers. Thank you very much. What made you choose a career in these fields? What made you sure? What was the moment you were sure that this was what you wanted to do?
As soon as I started doing it. I worked in New York. When I first got out of college, I thought I wanted to be a writer or a painter or an actor or an architect. And so I thought, go to New York and something will happen. Very much the same reason these people went to Paris. Go to New York and something will happen. So I came to New York and I got a job working at Time and Life. And I worked there for about 5.5 years, and then Kennedy was elected, and I quit my job because I took to heart his call to do something for your country. And I went to Washington and wound up working for the U.S. Information Agency. And while I was there...
That's when Edward Murrow was
there. Edward Murrow was the head of it, and it was a very exciting time, to say the least. And I was put in charge of the magazine for the Arab world, Al-Hayat fi America. I knew absolutely nothing about the Arab world, and the man who put me in the job knew that. I said, I know nothing about it. He said, you're going to learn a lot. And, I had to swim mighty hard to just stay afloat. But in the process, I had to do a lot of the work for the magazine because we had a very limited budget, small staff, myself, and work on weekends. And we'd go up to the Library of Congress to try to find material that was in the public domain that we could use in the magazine at no large expense. And while doing this, one weekend, when Rosalie, my wife, was with me, we saw some photographs that was in the library collection taken at Johnstown, Pennsylvania, very soon after the disaster of 1889. And I had grown up in that part of Pennsylvania. I'd heard about it all my life, but I had no idea of the level of destruction. And so I wanted to know what happened. So I took a book out of the library. It wasn't very good. and I could tell that the author didn't understand the geography of Western Pennsylvania. So I took another one out, and that wasn't very good. So I thought, why don't you try and write the book that you'd like to read? So I set off to write, and once I started, almost immediately, I thought, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And as you know, you don't have a long-range plan at that stage. I just did one book, and then did another book, and then another book, and pretty soon, I'm building a library of my own. I'm building a and in effect, that's what I still do. And I never think of myself as working. I'm doing what I do and what I want to do.
Do you, David? Do you do you write and research simultaneously?
Yes.
That's what I do. Yeah.
Yes. That's how you find out how much you don't know.
Exactly, and that's also you find out what you think about the subjects that you're. Don't you find that you?
And working on this book, for example, all the materials here, the letters, the diaries, they're all here in New York Historical Society, Library of Congress, Yale Library, so forth. So we would go over. We have been going over to Paris every year for a couple of weeks, mostly to see how much I got wrong, and to walk the walk and to soak it up and in all seasons.
Feel what that was like.
Yes, feel it. But I've done that with all my books. I've had to walk where they walk, be in the same room. I feel I'm trying always to get closer to them, closer through what they wrote, the feel of the paper they wrote on, the rooms they were in,
to be in Truman, with Truman in Independence.
Yes, to be inside their lives. People say, are you working on a book? And I say yes, but the preposition's wrong. I'm working in a book. And if I come out, I don't like it. I go back in again. Yeah.
Two people asked the same question with a different protagonist. What advice do you think John Adams / Harry Truman would give to the heads of the Republican and Democratic parties today?
Shape up.
John Adams would say this?
Oh, yeah. They would not be easy on them. And they would be, they would probably be having a second drink to ease their sorrows. It would be heartbreaking, I think, a lot of it. A lot of it, of course, they wouldn't understand. But I'm a short-range pessimist and a long-range optimist. I think that we go through these spells. What we don't know, and probably we can't know, is the impact of communications, television, whatever, on how we perceive reality and how we go about our political system.
Well, it's
become a kind of a vaudeville act.
Well, stop a second there, David, because you've had a very fruitful relationship with television. It's been part of what you've done, part of it.
Yes.
So do you not think that television can do as much good, mass media and the internet and so on, as it does harm?
I sat next to Stanley Marcus, the great
realtor,
department store genius,
Marcus.
at a dinner one night at the Wilson's house, you know, too. And I said to him, if you could wave a magic wand, and he was a very wonderfully wise man, and considerably older than I was, I said, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about our country for the better, what would you do? And he thought a minute, and he said, I'd do something about television. And I said, really, why that? He said, because if you could do something about that, think how much else you could accomplish. And I feel sometimes it's as if we've invented fire, and all we're doing is burning things down with it. We haven't figured out how to make use of it. Yes, exactly. So I'm very pleased, I felt very lucky to have played a part in public television the years I did and do. I still think there's an important place for public television. I think that the potential, however, for the medium is hardly been scratched. For education, for example, imagine what could be done with that medium. I also feel it's a big mistake to confuse information with learning. We pride ourselves in the information highways and the information generation.
Information society.
Information isn't learning. I like to tell students, if information were learning, therefore, if you memorize the World Almanac for 2 or 3 years, you would be educated. No, you wouldn't be educated. If you memorize the World Almanac, you'd be weird.
You'd be an idiot savant. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Education comes from teachers, from books, from and the midnight oil.
Yeah.
So I was just reading Lewis Thomas's, remember his wonderful book, Lives of the Cell?
Lives of the Cell, yes.
Just rereading that recently. He says in there he hasn't read yet about a computer that is of two minds on any question.
Are you online all the time? Do you use email?
No, Adam.
No, not at all? We can't get you?
No, I write on a Royal manual typewriter. I am about as technically challenged as anyone you've ever met.
That's my theory, is there's a certain cutoff time for all of us, right? And anything that was not in place when we were 45, we're incapable of using.
Well, people tell me, don't you realize how much faster you can? Of course I could go faster. I know that. I don't want to go faster. I want to go slower.
I'm content with the time.
I do. I write better if I go slower.
I think we all write better if we go slower. That's why it's a good thing.
The other thing is people say, how much of your time do you spend doing research and how much of your time do you spend writing? Well, it's a perfectly good question. Very rarely does anyone ever say, how much of your time do you spend thinking?
Yes.
And that's, as you know, the most important part of it.
Well, I find that if you're doing, that's exactly why you have to write while you're doing the research, because the writing is a form of thinking. It tells you what actually...
And you have ideas or insights because you were writing that you never would have if you weren't writing.
No.
The old idea of working your thoughts out in paper, it happens. It focuses the brain in some way that in a way that no other activity does.
Maybe we'll make this the last question, because we've been going a long time. Now that you have completed a new masterpiece, what is your next masterpiece? The last time you were here at the Y, you wouldn't tell. Perhaps this time you would give us a hint, a nibble, a little morsel, a little taste. This is clearly a Jewish mother out there, too. Give us a hint, David, a nibble, a little morsel, a taste.
Well, at risk of seeming insensitive to kind-hearted curiosity, I have to say the same as I said the last time. And I say it because I don't know. I'm considering a number of possibilities. But I don't really know what makes me decide to do the subjects I do. Something just clicks. Something just happens. I'll tell you what happened with this book. I've been interested in Paris since I was 15. Rosalie and I first went there 50 years ago this year. We've been going back. I've gone back to do research for 3 of my books, the Panama book, the Truman book, Adams book. But one day I was driving down Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, and it was morning, it was the rush hour, and there was a big traffic jam right at Sheridan Circle. In the middle of Sheridan Circle is an equestrian statue of General Phil Sheridan, done by the same sculptor who did the faces at Mount Rushmore. And
Borglum.
Pardon me?
Borglum, right?
Yes, Gutzon Borglum.
Right.
Thank you. And I was looking over it, wondering how many of these people that drive around this circle every day have any idea who that is or why he's there? And they go by it twice a day. Thousands of people. At the same time, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue started to play on my car radio. And I was, as I adore Gershwin, and I was being, as I always am, transported by his music. And the frustrations of the traffic jam and the rest just vanished. And I thought, he's alive for me and anybody else listening at this moment as if he were around the corner. And he's moving us. Who's more important, George Gershwin or Phil Sheridan? Well, the answer, of course, is they are both very important, but you can't leave the Gershwin side of life out of history. And Rhapsody in Blue started me thinking about American Paris, which I like even more. And on One Thing Led Another, there it is.
Well, you know what this makes me think, David? Actually, a wonderful book that would be a great gift from David McCullough is A Life of the Gershwins.
Or Cole, or Cole Porter.
Or Cole Porter, but either one. That's the Gershwin side of life. You say you haven't touched it. Those are wonderful lives.
I know the lyrics of all that music, the Broadway music of the 30s, 40s, 50s. I never memorized any of it. Never. It just became part of me. And my kids think I'm an idiot savant or something. But and I really think if you took away Willa Cather and Mark Twain and Emerson and Gershwin and Copeland, and if you took that away, that'd be like taking away the Mississippi River, the Rocky Mountains. That's part of who we are. And I really think that history ought to be written in that spirit. I think it ought to be taught in that spirit. And I think it ought to be enjoyed in that spirit.
Well, hear. I would love, David, I would love to have a David McCullough book, The Path Up and Downtown, A History of Broadway. That would be a terrific book. David, we can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for being here, for coming here.
Thank you.
And wonderful new book. And David is very kindly going to sign books for all of you who wanted to. David McCullough.
Thank you.